Welcome to episode number 45 of the MMA Rundown podcast. We're going to recap the event that just happened in Auckland. So that's going to be with the main event with Dan Hooker defeating Paul Felder. I'll recap the entire card, preview the upcoming card next week that's going to be headlined by a flyweight title fight. That's going to be UFC Norfolk. We've got Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury. Just a quick recap on that fight. Beyond that, I've got Diego Sanchez and his coach / guru Josh Fabia went on a pretty big press tour over the week. So I'll talk about what they had spoken about and kind of give my own take on that whole situation. We have a really big story in college wrestling where the guy who is likely to win the Hodge Trophy this year, which is for the top wrestler in all of college wrestling, a guy who's already won 2 national titles and is in contention for a spot on the world team for the U.S., Zahid Valencia is now indefinitely suspended for a drug test that was quote-unquote for a recreational drug. So I'll talk about that whole entire situation. Couple stupid little controversies on Twitter with fighters. I don't know whether or not they got themselves in trouble, but Henry Cejudo was one of them where him and Kieran Bryant were going at it, and a lot of people were giving their own take on it, so I'll recap what happened there. And then also Israel Adesanya made a 9/11 comment regarding Yoel Romero, so I'll talk about that one as well. Dana White also pissed a lot of people off by speaking at a Trump rally, so I'll talk about that. And then the last thing to mention will just be a couple of fight announcements that were made throughout the course of the week. So back to the top, we have Paul Felder versus Dan Hooker. And I guess before I get started on this, and this is going to be relevant too in the Karolina Kowalkiewicz fight too, I think it's pretty funny, and this is something that you might have seen if you were looking in the comments section of the last podcast. It wasn't something that I had mentioned in the podcast, but it was something that was brought up after. But last week, the Saturday of that week, I had a jiu-jitsu tournament, and in that tournament, like in my first match, a guy was like rolling underneath me for an Minari roll. So as I was like sprawling my leg back to like keep it away from him, I ended up like falling into his leg and getting kicked in the eye. And at least in jiu-jitsu, if you kick someone in the eye, that's illegal, so you kind of have to stop it. Whereas in MMA, if you get kicked in the eye, you kind of have to keep going because it wasn't an illegal strike. But that kick definitely had a big effect on me not being able to open up my eye and see, and like having to go through from there, and then seeing how long it took for me to be able to get my vision back. And one of the comments that I made regarding that was like, well, I guess if you're going to have to find a positive in it, I guess the next time that you have a fighter whose eye gets closed shut on him, you kind of can like feel for him and understand a little bit more. And then that was last week. And then this week, here we go. We have 2 fights, 2 of the final 3 fights where someone's eye was bothering them over the course of the entire fight. Now, Paul Felder actually handled it really well. His eye appeared to be swollen shut pretty much at the end of the first round. And it was sort of surprising to me in that usually if someone's like bleeding into their eye or if their eye gets swollen, like they'll bring a doctor in and constantly check and see if they can see out of that eye, and if they can't, they'll stop the fight. I expected the doctor to be really involved here with Paul Felder, and he really wasn't that involved. And it didn't look like he could really see all that much out of his eye, and his eye just wasn't opening up. On top of that, too, you could also tell like in between rounds that they were trying to ice it and try to get the swelling to come down, but I was in a pretty similar situation where I was like trying to ice my eye and get the swelling to come down, and it just wasn't. It wasn't helping over the course of like a single minute at a time. Or for me, it was a lot more than just a single minute. I was sitting there for like a few minutes at a time. So for Felder only having a minute between rounds, I was kind of like, yeah, I know what they're trying to do, but this isn't going to work, and it really didn't end up working for him. But even with that being the case, he was still able to make it throughout the entire fight. Fight pretty well, and in a lot of people's eyes, they thought he did enough to win that fight. Now, as far as what was happening in this fight, I was pretty surprised with Dan Hooker, in that it's not as though he's a guy who typically keeps his hands up and is always like super solid with his defensive fundamentals. He has very good head movement and is pretty good with his footwork in terms of getting out of the way, but that can only get you so far. Every so often, you're still going to be in position at that point. If you don't have your hands up, it's gonna cost you. Now, I was talking about this with the John Jones fight where he oftentimes is not in range to get hit, but when he is, he oftentimes does have his hand up and he's able to block it, and that really helped him out along the Dominic Reyes fight where Reyes was able to find his range, but fortunately for John Jones, he had his hand up and was able to block. For Dan Hooker, his hands were down a lot, and he really wasn't adjusting a whole lot on that. So for him, it seemed as though boxing had become a pretty big issue for him, where he was successful, at least like from range, just throwing a single jab, but he was having trouble like getting into the pocket and winning exchanges in the pocket. Anytime he was within boxing range, it seemed as though Paul Felder had a pretty big advantage on him there. And that definitely caused issues for him. So for Hooker, it seemed as though his main weapons in this fight were the jab, just kind of single shotting from range, and then also the low leg kick as well. Although oftentimes when he saw that leg kick, he wasn't setting it up with anything, which at times led to him getting his kicks checked and it's part of the reason why at the end of the night, I mean, granted, Felder landed a lot of good leg kicks himself, but at the end of the night, he had to go to the hospital and was having trouble walking around. Um, but with that being said, the jabs were there pretty often for him. He was very effective with them. Obviously, he was able to close Paul Felder's eye. So I would say the first round, he probably did enough there to win that round. Third round, probably give him that one as well. But in the fourth round, Felder really started to buckle down and really start going after him and throwing multi-punch combinations, and really was noticing the advantage that he had in the boxing range. And he was successful from there. He was able to land some really hard shots on Dan Hooker. Hooker eventually started shooting on Paul Felder to sort of mitigate that. I saw some people who were saying, "Oh, this is because Hooker realizes that he's losing on the feet, so he has to take to the ground." I didn't really read it as that so much as it was, if a guy keeps throwing punches at your head and you're able to duck underneath and at least offer a threat of the takedown, even if you're not able to hit the takedown, it's enough to sort of slow him down and get him off of that. So it seemed like for Dan Hooker, it was more of just, if he gets the takedown, that's nice. If he doesn't get it, though, it's more just something to give Paul Felder an area for concern where he's not just going to throw 3 or 4 punches straight at Hooker's head and expect nothing bad to happen to him. So it was more of a deterrence to the way Hooker, or to the way that Felder had adjusted later on in the fight. Also worth noting with those takedowns that Hooker was attempting, both by jiu-jitsu and wrestling rules, if you get behind someone in wrestling, you don't get the points for the takedown until you actually like get them down on the mat, whether they're like down on all fours or whether they're like posting down on their hands. And then for jiu-jitsu, you have to be able to get your hooks in to actually score the back point. So from a jiu-jitsu standpoint, Dan Hooker wasn't scoring from the position that he was in, and even in wrestling, or at least folk style wrestling, he wasn't scoring in the position that he was in. So for how much credit you want to give him for those takedowns, or for the takedown attempts, especially when he was behind Hooker or behind Felder on the feet. I mean, for the time that he's in that position, he's in a better position than Felder is, so I guess he's winning for that time period, but it's not as though he was terribly effective with that grappling. It wasn't effective enough to score a takedown under most wrestling rule sets, and it wasn't effective enough to take the back under a jiu-jitsu rule set. So to me, heading to the fifth round, I was pretty sure that rounds 1 and 3 were Hooker and 2 and 4 were Felder. So the fifth round was going to make the difference there. Felder was still finding success with his boxing in the fifth round, landed some pretty solid shots on Hooker. Hooker was then going back to the wrestling again to try to deter against a lot of the aggressive boxing that we were seeing out of Felder. And Hooker was eventually able to get the fight to the ground, didn't do a whole lot of damage from there, wasn't ever really in a position where he was close to getting a submission. So in terms of how effective he was on top, I wouldn't say it was that effective. I think that the effectiveness of Paul Felder on the feet was probably a little bit more, and probably was enough to make up for it. So I had thought, going to the judges' scorecards, that Felder was going to get the win there. Now, granted, with that being said, this is Dan Hooker in New Zealand, but ends up going to a split decision, and 2 of the 3 judges go 48-47 for Dan Hooker. One of them goes 48-47 for Felder, and Hooker gets the win there. So for Felder, he, not entirely surprisingly, because he had talked about this before, he was saying that he's 35 right now. This is like his last big run at a title. If he's going to make it, then that's great. If he isn't, then he's going to want to do something else, especially since he's probably making pretty good money commentating on fights. So for him, I think he was kind of in a position where just at any point, whenever the next loss comes, that's going to be the final one for him, and he's ready to move on. So because his hand wasn't raised here, I guess to that extent, he's like, all right, well, I guess this is that loss that I was thinking of, so this means I'm probably going to stop. And that's why he was taking his gloves off and talking about, oh, well, I guess this is probably going to be it for me. With that being said, if my understanding of what his motivation is correct, and his motivation is that he wants to take one final run at a title, whether or not he retires, I think, is going to be determined on what the UFC offers him moving forward. So if they're like, okay, do you want to fight this guy ranked number 11 or this guy ranked number 13? They think at that point, Felder's going to be like, you know what, I'm done here. But if they look at it like, look, this is a fight between 6 and 7, it's a split decision. Some people thought Felder won. Like, we're not going to move him back in the rankings, and we're going to match him up with a similar guy that he would have gone matched up with had the third judge given it to him instead of Hooker. I think there's a decent chance that he comes back and he's not done yet. So for Paul Felder and his career, to me, I think it's just going to come down to what the UFC matchmakers offer him, whether or not he's going to be coming back. Now for Hooker, he made a call out of Justin Gaethje. Now, I guess after watching this fight, it definitely makes you concerned for Dan Hooker's boxing and how he's going to deal with some of the better boxers in the division. Gaethje also has trouble with boxers, but I would imagine that Gaethje's boxing is going to be a little bit better than Hooker. Hooker is pretty good about mixing up to the body, though, And the guys who have given Justin Gaethje a lot of problems in the past are guys who do a very good job of mixing it up to the body. So it's not as though this is a fight where I think Hooker's just going to get annihilated, but he's definitely going to have to be able to keep his hands up because he was getting hurt pretty bad by Felder. And I feel like if he does the same stuff with Justin Gaethje and Gaethje just starts swinging wild on him, like if something lands, it's going to be a big problem for Hooker. So Hooker needs to clean up his defense, particularly in boxing range here, if he wants to be successful against Gaethje. And if he has to start shooting takedowns on Gaethje in the same way they did against Felder to sort of limit the strikes, that could be an issue for him as well. So that can be a tough matchup for him, just from a matchup standpoint. Now, with that being said, if you're Dan Hooker, you're looking for the most winnable matchup that you think you can find among guys ranked ahead of you. So I guess among the guys that are ranked ahead of him, he figures that Justin Gaethje is going to be the most winnable of those matchups, which I guess you could possibly argue that's the case. They're all tough matchups ahead of him. The only question is going to be, is this a fight that's realistic or not? Is this a fight that the UFC is going to make? I think at this point, the UFC is probably not going to be making any fights for Justin Gaethje before April 19th, with the only exceptions being if someone backs out of the April 18th title fight, in which case they push him in there instead of Conor, or if Conor and Gaethje is just a fight that gets made. So, to me, while this fight would be interesting, I don't know if it was the best call that Hooker could have made, but I guess he's fairly limited on his options now, given that two of the guys are already in a title fight. A third guy in Conor McGregor is basically like a waste of time to call out at this point. So it's not as though he had a whole lot of options in front of him, but he felt that Gaethje was the guy to call out. Other fights to look at on this card. In the co-main event, we had Jimmy Crute versus Michael Oleksiejczuk. This fight, every so often I talk about the way that takedowns are scored and how the people who do these stats, if they don't know how to score a takedown, how are they going to be able to handle the more advanced stuff? The official takedown count on this was 8 takedowns out of 10 attempts in a 3.5-minute fight. There were not 8 takedowns for Jimmy Crute. Jimmy Crute got a takedown and then was having trouble keeping Michael Oleksiejczuk on the mat, so Oleksiejczuk would kind of pop back up. There'd be another mat return. He'd pop back up, another mat return. So just a bunch of mat returns, not exactly new takedowns, but the way it was scored as though Crute was just hitting takedown after takedown. It was more just he got a couple takedowns and then had to hit a bunch of mat returns to get Oleksiejczuk back to the mat. But finally was able to get him get him from top of half guard. Oleksiejczuk just wasn't doing anything from bottom of half guard. I'm not sure what his strategy was, but he just kind of left his half guard open, got past, and Crute was able to go for a Kimura, stepped over and was able to get it behind his back, crank on it, and was able to get the win there. So pretty dominant performance from Crute. You would have liked to have seen him be a little bit stickier on top and not allow Oleksiejczuk to constantly keep popping up over and over to have to drag him down again, but he was able to make his adjustment, get on top of half guard, and sort of secure the bottom leg. And in wrestling, they call it like a Turk. Effectively in jiu-jitsu, it's like when you just kind of stay heavy from half guard so they can't like scoot their leg out underneath. But it's why a lot of wrestlers like to ground and pound from top of half guard. Like Cormier loves to ground and pound from top of half guard because you can control that bottom leg and make it tougher for someone to get up. But that's how Crute was able to finally like secure position on top. Without Oleksiejczuk constantly popping up again and again and again. And then from there, he was eventually able to pass, find a submission, and get the win. In the fight before that, we had Karolina Kowalkiewicz versus Yan Xiaonan. This fight just did not go well at all for Kowalkiewicz. She got punched in the eye, it looked like, early on in the fight, and was just kind of like rubbing her eye the entire fight, which just wasn't a good look for her. You almost kind of felt like from her corner standpoint, like, look, if you're going to keep rubbing your eye, like, we're going to have to take you out of here. Like, you either got to no-sell it and be able to fight through it, or we got to get that shit checked out. But it was just kind of weird how that was being handled. But Xiaonan was badly outlanding her on the feet. As bad as the fight was going for Karolina, though, in the third round, she was able to get her, I guess it depends on who you train under and what you want to call it. I think outside Senkaku is what like the Danaher Death Squad would call it, just an outside reap on Xiaonan's left leg, though. And it looked as though she was going for like a straight ankle lock from there, which is kind of odd. Usually when you get that reap, you want to go for the heel hook. But wasn't effective with the ankle lock. Eventually got to a point where the heel hook was starting to present itself, but there were just a bunch of little details that Karolina was missing. But it was kind of crazy because having that position for as long as she did, it wasn't as though she was very far away from getting a heel hook and being able to finish it. Like, the position was in place. Like, she did the hard work, the easier work, I feel like, once you've already got the position secured, once you've got that outside reap. I feel like at that point it's easier to get the finish than it is to get that position in the first place. But Karolina was having a lot of trouble. It was even like going for a guillotine at one point with that outside reap, which was just an odd position. But unfortunately for her, wasn't able to find the submission. Eventually used it to get on top and sweep at the end of the round, but she only had like 20 seconds at that point, wasn't able to get a finish and wasn't able to win. But it's kind of crazy for as long as that lasted, where it's like, wow, Karolina was getting hammered this entire fight, but like the win is right in front of her right now. Like she can get the submission right here and she can get the finish, but I just don't know how much she trains with leg locks, but whatever the case may be, there were a lot of little details that little adjustments that could have been made to get the finish there. I don't know what her coaches were yelling at her, but unfortunately for her, she wasn't able to find the finish and sort of had a wasted opportunity there. So now she goes on a 4-fight losing streak. Though she was a former title challenger, when you're losing 4 straight, especially when you're not looking great in the process, it's sort of tough for the UFC to keep you around. So I'm not sure what's going to be next for her. It's not like she can go down to 105. I don't know if that would even make sense for her. She definitely looks like the smaller and less physical fighter at 115, so it's not like going up to 125 would make things any better for her. So we'll see where she goes from here, but that was sort of a tough third round to watch where it's like, wow, she might be able to pull off the comeback, and it just didn't work out for her. Fight before that, we had Marcos Cejudo de Lima versus Ben Sassoli. Sassoli, I believe his last fight before that was the loss to Greg Hardy that was overturned after Hardy had used the inhaler in the corner. But this fight didn't go very well for Sassoli. Cejudo de Lima landed a huge shot on him. Sassoli just kind of went face down, and de Lima was looking to throw again, and the ref jumps in, stops the fight, and you have a TKO win for Marcos Cejudo de Lima. And then we had Brad Riddell versus Magomed Mustafayev, which was an excellent fight. Riddell landed a really big right hand to drop Mustafayev in the first round. Then he was on top trying to finish. Wasn't successful in doing so, and kind of got caught in like this tough grappling exchange where Mustafayev would keep taking him down. Riddell would kind of keep getting back up, but not like escaping Mustafayev's grasp. So Mustafayev really wasn't doing a whole lot to score points. Like he'd kind of get a takedown, but he wasn't really controlling position. He wasn't doing any damage from there. So Riddell, having done the damage that he did on the feet, was able to make up for the time that he was losing the grappling exchanges. And then in the later rounds, some he was more effective than others, but eventually this goes to a decision. It's a split decision, 29-28, two times for Riddell and one time for Mustafayev. In the prelims, we had Kevin Aguilar versus Zubaira Tukhugov. Aguilar's looked pretty good prior to this fight, so I figured this would be a pretty tough fight for Zubaira. Zubaira likes to wrestle, but he also throws a lot of heavy hands as well. So for him, it's sort of like one of those tough things where if you keep your hands down with him, it's going to be a problem because he's going to throw some huge, heavy shots at you, and that was an issue for Aguilar. So Tukhugov was able to land a huge, I believe it was a left hook, that rocked Aguilar, and then from there, Zubaira was just throwing haymaker after haymaker, and eventually was able to put Kevin down, landed a bunch of shots with Aguilar not being able to close his guard or control his posture, and from there the ref had to jump in and stop the fight. We had Jalen Turner versus Joshua Kulibau. Turner, it seems as though Turner's plan was just a strike in here, and Kulibau wanted to make this a grappling match. Even had a moment where he attempted like one of those Damian Maia half guard pulls, where he'll pull a half guard and then try to like come up to a single leg off of that. So he'll kind of use like a half guard pull as a way to set up a takedown. But wasn't super successful with that. Turner was very successful on the feet. They go to the second round, and I think at that point, though it seemed as though Kulibau wanted to grapple and Turner wanted to strike, I think Turner realized that the difference in their grappling wasn't that significant, where he just didn't want to get involved with that at all. So he was starting to really settle into his positions. Eventually was able to get Kulibau's back, was able to flatten him out, land a bunch of shots, and eventually the ref had to step in and call a TKO on it. We had a great fight between Jake Matthews and Emil Meek. I guess with the main event being 5 rounds, that sort of gave it the edge there, but I kind of figured this was going to be the fight of the night prior to that. But these guys absolutely went to war. Matthews was landing a lot of big shots, was able to drop Meek a couple times, was definitely the better grappler, but wasn't able to like secure a dominant position and put a ton of damage on him on the ground, or even like get close to finishing a submission, though he was on his back at one point. And then for Meek, pretty strong, really good at getting back up, and then was throwing some pretty heavy shots at himself. Had some moments where it looked like he was getting pretty close to putting Matthews in a tough spot where he might be able to get a finish, but unfortunately wasn't able to do so. So Matthews ends up getting the win here, 2 rounds to 1, 29-28 on all 3 judges' scorecards. We had Callum Potter versus Song Kanan. Potter was just having a lot of trouble in the striking ranges. Did get the fight to the ground at one point. Looked to pass him out. Lost position in the process. Kanan got back up, and then was able to land a bunch of shots on him. Had a really nice little combo where he stunned him and then landed a few more shots to put him down and then put him out afterwards. So Song Kanan gets the win there. Kai Kara France versus Tyson Nam was a pretty nice flyweight fight. Tyson Nam was pushing forward from the middle the entire time. Kai Kara France was kind of on the edge the entire time, just looking to counter, but he's able to land a lot of pretty good shots nevertheless. No one was really all that close to being finished over the course of this fight, but pretty high output fight out of both of them. I think both of them. Trying to think of what the stats were on that. I guess the stats it says here is 257 attempted strikes for Kai Kara France to 155 attempted strikes for Tyson Nam. So both these guys were throwing the entire time. We had Loma Lukbunmi versus Angela Hill. Angela Hill mostly outstruck Loma from the feet, which is pretty surprising given the pedigree of Loma, although Loma didn't necessarily look like the fighter that her pedigree indicated over the course of this fight. Her striking really didn't look all that sharp. But Angela, being the longer fighter, was pretty successful in landing from range, landing some nice elbows as well. Had a moment in, I believe, the second round where she was getting close to finishing a triangle choke and was missing some details there. It's kind of funny that on the Joe Rogan Experience they were talking about how she had the fight against Yan Xiaonan, who had beaten Kovalkiewicz on this card, and that she lost the decision there, but that she was very close to finishing a triangle there, wasn't able to put all the details together and get the finish there, and ends up losing the fight. And then in this case, again, she's in a triangle choke where it looked as though she should have been able to finish this one as well, but kind of blows it, misses a few details here or there, and loses the position. But at least in this case, was dominant in all the other rounds, was able to get the win here. Two of the judges gave Loma the second round, I believe, though, so it was 29-28, 29-28, and 30-27. And then the first fight in the card was Priscilla Cachoeira versus Shayna Dobson. Dobson now falls to 3-4 after losing to Cachoeira. Gets caught with a giant uppercut right off the bat, 40 seconds in, and that's the end of that. So Priscilla Cachoeira finally gets a win in the UFC. So for her, she was often referred to as like one of the worst fighters in the UFC, in large part due to how bad her performance was against Valentina Shevchenko, where she got outstruck like 250-3. But for her, it's nice for her to finally get a win. And I guess if you're going to talk about like the worst fighter in the UFC, you probably have to like pass that mantle on to Shannon Dobson, who now has a losing record and just lost to Priscilla Cachoeira pretty badly. So next topic to talk about is going to be the upcoming fight night that's coming up in Norfolk. A lot of fights on this card have some very small names on it, or names that people aren't all that familiar with. There are some pretty decent names that are mixed in here, so I'll go from bottom to top rather than top to bottom as I usually do. So the first fight on the card, you have Sean Brady, who's 11-0. I'm not terribly familiar with him, against Ishmael Nardia, who's 19-3, who's a pretty solid prospect who's had some tough losses early in his UFC career. We've got Alon Cruz versus Spike Carlisle. Jordan Griffin, 17-7 versus TJ Brown at 11-6, which is sort of an odd fight on the UFC card. We've got Marcin Tybura at 17-6 versus Sergey Spivak at 10-1. Spivak, I believe his last fight was the one against Tuivasa, where he was able to out-wrestle him. Eventually got him on the ground and was able to finish him from there. So Spivak, being in the heavyweight division where there aren't exactly a ton of fantastic wrestlers, sort of drew attention to himself as a guy who could be a pretty good wrestler in the UFC. So he'll have an opportunity with Tybura, a guy who used to be ranked, to really show how good he can be. And if this is a win that Spivak's able to pick up, he might find himself in the rankings after this fight. So this is actually a pretty decent fight here. Brendan Allen's a pretty good prospect. He'll be fighting Tom Breeze, who I feel like it was like 5 or 6 years ago was one of those guys who I think was fighting out of TriStar. And he had a lot of hype behind him. His record right now is 11-1, so I guess he's been pretty inactive for a while. I have seen him every so often on the grappling scene. Like I think he's been in a couple of EBIs. I'm pretty sure he's a black belt at this point, but Brendan Allen's a really tough guy. I believe he's based out of the Midwest, so that should be a pretty good fight. Got Gabriel Silva versus Kyler Phillips. Luis Valenvabras Pena versus Alex Munoz. I think Munoz might be that guy from Looking for a Fight. That's if I remember right. So that's an interesting fight there. And then on the main card, you've got Darek Minner versus Grant Dawson. Megan Anderson versus Norma Dumont. So I guess that's a big fight in the women's flyweight division. They don't really have rankings there, so they don't have a number by her name. But I guess there's a top 5 women's flyweight just by being a member of the women's flyweight division. Really good fight between Ion Kutalaba versus Magomed Ankalaev. Kutalaba, I believe, is coming off of a win over Khalil Roundtree. I think that was his last fight. But he's looked pretty dangerous at times. And then Ankalaev is coming off of that awesome front kick to the face win against, I think it was Dalcha Lungiambala. But Ankalaev is a guy who a lot of people expect to be a top 15, top 10, maybe even higher contender at the light heavyweight division. But on that UFC Russia card, when they were trying to like hype up all these up-and-coming Russian prospects, I feel like Ankalaev was probably the guy who stood out the most, outside of maybe Zabit in the main event. We've got Felicia Spencer versus Zara Farron as well. So Spencer's now 7-1 after her last loss to Chris Cyborg. Zara Farron is 6-3. And then in the main event, and this is the fight that is the main reason why I'm going to be tuning in, because it's going to be a great fight. We have a flyweight title fight between Davison Figueiredo and Joseph Benavidez. So for Benavidez, it'll be interesting to see where he's at this point in his career. He's sort of had some ups and downs in his career. Looks as though he's kind of back on another upswing right now. He's not training out of California anymore. He's training out of Las Vegas. Training with 10th Planet for jiu-jitsu. I'm not sure where his striking and all-around MMA team is at, but with that being said, he's looked pretty good in his recent fights, and for him, he's going to get another title fight here. You wonder if this is going to be the one where he finally breaks through and finally gets that title wrapped around his waist. But Figueiredo is going to be a tough guy to deal with. Really good jiu-jitsu, although he definitely likes to stand and throw a lot more. And I could see Benavidez outpointing him, but with this being a 25-minute fight, that's plenty of time for Figueiredo to land some pretty heavy shots and find room for his offense. So we'll have to see how it goes. But this is definitely a fight that I'm excited about and happy that I have an ESPN Plus subscription and I'm able to watch it. So that covers it for UFC Norfolk. Next thing to talk about is just briefly the big boxing fight. I don't cover a ton of boxing. The main reason why is because I don't watch a ton of boxing. So if not really watching it or following it, then I'm probably not going to have great coverage of it. Now, this Fury versus Wilder fight was probably one of the biggest fights that they've had in boxing for quite a while, maybe outside of the Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather fight. So this one definitely did draw my attention, especially with the first fight being as good as it was. So coming in, you had two guys who were still technically undefeated. You had Tyson Fury, who was undefeated, and then Deontay Wilder, who, though he should have probably lost a decision in his last fight, even though he had basically knocked Tyson Fury dead in the 12th round, he was still technically undefeated because that fight did go to a draw. So the question was, how is this fight going to differ? Is it going to be pretty similar in that you're going to have like this war where Tyson Fury outboxes Deontay Wilder, then Wilder lands some huge shots, and then Fury has to find a way to survive? But Fury was just dominant from start to finish here. Did take a few shots here and there, but for the most part was able to outbox Deontay Wilder, was able to drop him early on. Had Fury bleeding, or had Wilder bleeding from his ear. Now it sounds like it was an actual cut in his ear. It wasn't like a broken eardrum, which is really good news for Deontay Wilder. But he just consistently put a beating on Wilder. Wilder looked exhausted. It wasn't clear whether with him it was just a matter of him putting on too much weight before this fight, or whether he was just kind of gassed in the middle rounds and was just trying to take those rounds off and recover for the later rounds, but never really had a chance to. But with that being said, was getting dropped a couple times, and late in the 7th round, as he's getting beat up against the ropes, his corner throws in the towel. Ref jumps in, and that's the end of the fight. So for Tyson Fury, he's still undefeated. For Deontay Wilder, he's now suffered his first loss. As far as what's next for them, there's a lot of talk about Joshua versus Fury. That'd be a very entertaining fight, a very good fight, but I'm not sure how the business side of that's going to work out. It's also going to be interesting to see how Wilder's able to recover from this and what the extent of his injuries are. I don't know if they're going to want to run right back into the trilogy fight. If they didn't do a rematch right away the first time, I don't know why they would do a rematch right away this time. So it's also possible that these guys from here are just going to be fighting whoever their mandated contenders are. But it was definitely an interesting fight. It was a fight that drew a lot of attention in the MMA community as well. And so I felt like it was just worthwhile just mentioning how the fight went and how Tyson Fury was able to get the win there. As far as any crossovers, though, Stipe Miocic was tweeting about and talking about how now he wanted to have a shot at Tyson Fury. It just comes across as pretty pathetic if he's asking for a boxing fight with him. Like, if you want to have an MMA fight with him, then okay, cool. It could be like, all right, let's see who the baddest man on the planet really is now. Like, now that you've established yourself as the baddest dude in boxing, and I've established myself as the baddest dude in MMA, like, let's fight it out in MMA. But with him asking for a boxing fight, it's pretty clear he just assumes that the boxing fight is going to provide more money for him, and so he's just asking for whatever's going to pay him the most. But though Stipe has good boxing, he's not on the level of Tyson Fury, and if he wants a boxing match with Tyson Fury, it's definitely not going to go any better for him than it went for Deontay Wilder. So I would hope that they don't make it in that manner, but we still have to see if Stipe Miocic's eye is okay, and if he's going to be able to even return at this point. So it seems like there's a lot more that has to happen. I don't expect Stipe versus Tyson Fury to be a fight that happens anytime within the next 12 months, if at all. But it is something that was talked about, so I guess it was worth mentioning. Next topic to talk about is going to be Diego Sanchez and his coach/guru, Josh Fabia. So last week I talked about just the decision by Diego to ask the ref if his opponent, if Michel Pereira was going to get DQ'd, and then once he had that information, then deciding to not continue and take the DQ win. And I was talking about how I don't really have too many issues with him doing that, and I understand where he's coming from, and that in asking the question in the first place, is this guy getting a DQ, it kind of shows that it's not as though he was scared of Michelle Pereira so much as it was that he was just trying to make a strategic decision. But there were a lot of people who felt as though Diego Sanchez quit, and he got a lot of flack for it. But even more so than that, he got a lot of flack for coming out again with that bizarre single man corner, consisting of a guy who really doesn't have an MMA background, and Josh Fabia. So I guess after enough people decided to rip on him, they decided that they had to go to some of the bigger names in MMA media, Ariel Helwani, Luke Thomas, and a few other guys, and give interviews and talk and give their side of the story. And I'm trying to think of how I can recap it because it was just so bizarre and disjointed what was coming out of their mouths. Specifically Fabia. I guess the big point that he was having was like, look, I'm doing what's best for Diego Sanchez. Like, don't be mad at me for trying to help the guy. No one else is trying to help him. He was saying that his stuff works and that it makes Diego Sanchez so much better defensively than everyone else. But that Diego was like at this massive disadvantage by being forced to fight Michelle Pereira. Look, here's the thing that's tough about this for me is that if someone is just kind of putting on an act, fact-checking an actor is just a really stupid thing to do. Like, when Colby Covington, like, starts talking about, like, his past fights, like, you kind of get that, you get what he's doing. Like, though there may be some truth in what he's saying, what he's trying to do is effectively, like, play the role of a character, like, oh no, everything was going perfect, like nothing bad was happening, Kamaru Usman wasn't successful at all, it was all the ref. Where in reality, like, you know that there's some truth to it, and fact checking it, it's kind of like, yeah, but that's kind of the point, like, he's playing a character. With Fabia, it's kind of hard to tell if he's playing a character, if he actually believes what he's saying. So if he actually believes what he's saying, then like fact checking him, it kind of makes sense. But if he's just kind of like putting on and like just sort of like playing into a role, and like fact checking a character is just sort of like a weird thing to do. So I'm going to say that Fabia means everything that he says and he believes what he says, so I'm going to I suppose I'm going to fact check it right now. But with that being said, if it later comes out that he's just been like trolling this entire time, I guess I'll feel like a bit of an idiot for doing this, but I guess here goes nothing. First off, one of the big points that he was making about this fight was that the UFC had screwed Diego Sanchez by giving him this fight against this much bigger, much taller, much more explosive, much longer guy, and how that's why the fight was going so poorly for him. Just a quick little fact check in terms of who Michelle Pereira has fought recently and how his results have been. Literally, the last fight that Michelle Pereira had was against a lightweight who took a fight on short notice, and Tristan Connolly, and that lightweight beat him. That lightweight was Tristan. So again, that was Tristan Connolly, and Connolly primarily was able to fall on his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills to win that fight. Now, that being said, Diego Sanchez is also a pretty good black belt himself. That's how he was able to win the fight against Mickey Gall. So this idea that Diego Sanchez was just like in this no-win situation when literally the last fight that Michelle Pereira had was a loss against a guy who, like Diego Sanchez, was undersized, and like Diego Sanchez had an advantage in the grappling, it definitely shows an issue with the logic there. There's also this talk of Diego Sanchez having like amazing defense. In the interview that he did with Ariel Helwani, he like starts the interview off by talking about how he got his ribs broken on a freaking knee. Like, if your defense is so fantastic on what Fabio is teaching you, why are you in range to get your ribs broken with a knee that's coming in that hard? So again, there's an issue there. The Mayweather level defense, like, that was stupid. Diego's obviously getting hit in the head plenty. I was getting hit in the body plenty. Even if you're not getting hit in the head a ton, if you're getting just led up to the body to the point where you're getting dropped, your defense is not all that effective now, is it? Like, so a lot of the points they were making, there was definitely a lack of truth there. I respect that a lot of the interviewers, whether it was Luke Thomas or whether Ariel Helwani, they just kind of went along with it to let him talk. I think in the case like that, where you have someone who's as controversial and who a lot of people don't agree with, though it can be easy to just sort of like rip on them and just like challenge them when you have an interview and pretty much make a debate out of it, and maybe you can get like a fun little clip there and post it to Twitter and get a bunch of likes on it. I feel like the better interview that you're going to get is if you just kind of let them talk and let them hang themselves with their own words. So rather than you like trying to like burn them or like catch them off guard, just kind of let them keep talking, let them keep saying stupid stuff, and then let the people who are watching hear that stupid stuff and be like, oh, this guy's just out of his mind. The story that I feel like a lot of people haven't been talking about with this, though, like, I think we're pretty much all in agreement, like, this Fabia guy's a kook, this Fabia guy is definitely a scam artist. To me, the greater question is, how did he get Diego Sanchez to fall for it? Because it's not as though, when you have like these, I guess bullshido is the term that's used, when you have these like bullshido guys who are just sort of like these fake martial artists, it's one thing if you're like preying on someone who is getting bullied at school or bullied at work, and they just want to find something that seems like an easy fix to it. It's one thing if you're like preying on a woman, for example, who is worried about getting sexually assaulted, and you're trying to find an easy fix for her. Diego Sanchez, before he met Fabio, was a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He had a pretty decent wrestling background. Obviously, a very high-level MMA background to the point where he was fighting for a title at one point in the lightweight division. Like, this isn't a guy who should be falling for a guy like Fabio. So the question is, why did he? And how is he still with this guy at this point? I guess technically now I think he's 2-1. He had the loss to Chiesa, was going to lose to Pereira, but ends up getting a DQ win there, and then had the win against Mickey Gall, who really probably shouldn't be in the UFC at this point. I mean, he was a terrible matchup for CM Punk, but the guy is effectively like a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with very little striking or wrestling. Like, in the welterweight division, there are plenty of black belts who can strike and wrestle, who can barely hang on to a spot in the roster, never mind a guy like Mickey Gall. So for Sanchez, he was able to take advantage of the wrestling deficiency there and take advantage of the striking deficiency there, and even have with a better Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu acumen than Mickey Gall had, he was able to dominate on the ground. So that was a fight that would just work for him, I think, regardless of whoever's coaching him. But with that being said, he's still with Fabio, and he still seems to believe in Fabio. So the question is, why? Like, how did this happen? And from what Diego says, he talks about like how they were like wrestling around at one point, and then like Fabio like put him in a weird position where he like had his arm stuck behind his back, and that like proved to him that it was real. I have no idea what the guy's talking about or like what that position even looks like. I also kind of wish that even though the interviews were pretty good, or pretty good about letting them hang themselves, I would have liked to have had an interview just ask him like, hey, had Sanchez been able to continue, like, what technical advice would you have given him in the third round? Like, just any kind of question where it's like, what technical advice would you have had to deal with Michel Pereira? Just to hear Fabia like have to give technical fight advice, I think that would have been a good question to give there. But it seems as though like from a fight side, there's not a whole lot there now. The timing of when he met him, it seemed as though Diego was disgruntled with the coaching that he was getting at Greg Jackson. It seemed as though he was in the middle of a divorce. So for him, he kind of felt like nobody really cared about him. And so for Fabio to come along and kind of like show interest in him and like show that he cared about him, at least from that standpoint, I can understand why Sanchez would take him in as like a friend or as a close confidant. But like moving that on to the coach level, it still somewhat throws me off and is surprising to me. Because this is definitely a different situation than most of these like Bullshido stories. Most of the time with a Bullshido story, it's people have no idea what they're getting into, who then get tricked. But in this case, Diego Sanchez should know what he's getting into. So the fact that he had the martial arts background he did, and he still is with Fabia, I think is really interesting and definitely still kind of bizarre. And the fact that the two do interviews together doesn't necessarily make it any easier. I don't know if we're ever really gonna like have a full understanding. Maybe if Fabia is like a former wrestler, a high school wrestler, like maybe he knows just enough wrestling to like put on and make it seem like he knows what he's talking about. But whatever the case may be, like it's just crazy to me that a guy like Diego Sanchez, even in the emotional situation he was in, would end up falling for him in the way that he has. Next thing to talk about is going to be a huge story in college wrestling. So Zahid Valencia, as I mentioned before, two-time national champion, is expected to win the national title this year very easily for Arizona State. This is his senior year. Just did a international wrestling tournament called the Mateo Pelicon, which is a pretty big ranking series event. I believe he was able to win that entire tournament as well. So he's a guy who's being looked at as a real contender for a spot on the roster for 86 kilograms for the U.S. Now, granted, they have David Taylor, who is the 2018 world champion, wasn't able to go last year because he had a pretty bad knee injury from the Beat the Streets event, where Jordan Burroughs was able to beat Ben Askren. But for him at that event, I'm not sure who administered the test, but someone administered a test there, and he tested positive for a recreational drug. Now, most people on Twitter are saying marijuana. I don't know if these people like have insider information. I think it's a pretty safe assumption that if it's a recreational drug, it probably is marijuana. But it seems as though a marijuana test was popped. And depending on who the test was underneath, if it's under international testing, then until the international until the UWW clears him, the NCAA cannot let him wrestle based on their own rules. If it wasn't the UWW though, I think it's a little bit murkier. But given the way that the wrestling rules work, he has to be freed of his suspension in a couple weeks for the Pac-12 tournament. If he's not freed by then, he can't wrestle in the national. So that means that he would miss the national tournament his senior year, which would just be a disaster for Arizona State. but also just a really unfortunate situation if this is what people expect. I mean, really, even if it isn't, we're talking about a recreational drug. Like, we know that the test was failed for recreational drugs. Like, even if he was doing, like, coke in Italy, or even if he was doing heroin in Italy, like, should that preclude him from wrestling for a national title this year? Regardless of his ranking, but especially as the guy who's number one and as the guy who's favored to win the Hodge Trophy. I definitely don't think so, but especially not for marijuana. So this is a situation that we've got a couple weeks to work with right now. Some people are saying that this is a done deal. He's just not going to be able to get back in time. Some people think there's a chance he is going to be able to get back in time, but either way, just a really unfortunate situation, and hopefully he is able to get back. But if not, to have arguably the best wrestler in college wrestling in this year have to miss the national tournament because he tested positive for what's likely marijuana, just a really unfortunate situation. I hope everything gets sorted out. I know some people are talking about, oh, well, yes, it's a stupid rule, but you know the rules that you're dealing with. I don't know if he really was all aware of the rules that he was dealing with, particularly since this drug test was while he was overseas and not doing any activity with the actual team. And again, even if you know that marijuana is tested for, you might not know like to what level it is, or you might not know when to expect the drug test. Like, I understand why you would want to blame Zahid Valencia for putting himself in the situation in the first place by smoking marijuana or doing whatever recreational drug it was, but to me, the punishment definitely does not fit the crime here, and hopefully the punishment gets fixed to the point where it's not going to take him out of the Pac-12 tournament or take him out of the NCAA tournament. So a couple stupid little Twitter controversies. We have the first one with Henry Cejudo, where he was doing his typical cringe thing. Posted a video, and then in the caption to it, he was just talking crap about a couple of the bantamweight contenders. I think Peter Yan was one of them, and Aljamain Sterling was the other one. And he referred to Aljamain Sterling as Aljamima, which of course is a reference to Aunt Jemima, the mascot for a very large breakfast foods company that is owned by Quaker Oats. And Karen Bryant, of all people, decided that she wanted to weigh in on this and say, hey, you can't make an Aunt Jemima reference. That's racist. Like, this is not okay. And so then you had like this uproar in the community where there's like a split where half the people were like, yeah, we agree with Karen Bryant. Like, this is racist. Henry Cejudo shouldn't have said it. The other people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this is just a stupid little nickname. This is like very mild trash talk. Like, why are we pretending that this is racist? We know that Henry Cejudo doesn't mean that in a racist manner. As far as where I fall on it, I would definitely side on the Henry Cejudo is not racist, and this doesn't come across as racist to me. Some of the people who were trying to make this racist were like pulling up like old Wikipedia articles about Aunt Jemima and like the origins of Aunt Jemima and where that name comes from. I haven't gone through and read them, but here's the thing. Aunt Jemima is still the corporate mascot for that company. Like, you can still go into the grocery store right now and buy Aunt Jemima pancakes or Aunt Jemima cereal. They're not cereal, syrup. So if this is as awful as a corporate mascot as people are making out to be, then you need to be focusing on Quaker Oats and like talk to them and like try to get them to rebrand that whole entire breakfast food line. But as long as it's not rebranded, as long as it is the way that it is, you can't really blame anyone for thinking, hey, this is still like a pretty common brand. Like, it can't be that offensive. Like let's face it. If we're thinking of other corporate mascots, like, do you know the background of the Hamburglar? Do you know the background of Ronald McDonald? Like, why is it a clown? Do we know the background of Grimace? Do we know the background of, I don't know, like Spyro the Dragon? Maybe there's something evil about Spyro the Dragon. Like, you can't expect people to understand like the entire backstory of every single corporate mascot. If the corporate mascot's still there, especially in a time like this where people are complaining about literally everything that they deem as like partially racist, if the corporate mascot's still there, I don't blame someone for making the assumption that there's really nothing all that offensive about her. That's mildly offensive, if that. So for Henry Cejudo to make a reference to Aunt Jemima, thinking that there's nothing racist about Aunt Jemima specifically, can't blame him for that. I don't see any racist intent there. Now, obviously, if you're thinking about what the term racism means, it means that you feel as though someone is lesser based on their race than they would be had they been a different race. Do I feel as though Henry Cejudo, in calling Aljamain Sterling Aljamima, was trying to belittle him because he's black? No. It's just he was trying to make him sort of like split it. It's sort of like when you have a guy named like Chris and you like call him Christine or Christy. Like, you're just like making like this lazy joke that's like kind of comparing him to a girl. To me, that was just the same idea there, where Aljamima was kind of like that. It was like a Chris Christie type of situation there. I don't mean like the governor of New Jersey, but Chris Christine, we'll call it that. It was like a Chris Christine type of situation there. And the people who are making it out to be like this awful racist thing, like, it was pretty clear to me that Henry Cejudo did not mean to like make a racist statement there with Henry Cejudo. Henry was sort of trolling with Aljamima afterwards, where Aljamima was like talking about how like Henry acted like he had like a big burrito in his stomach when he got kneed by Demetrius Johnson. That was like a reference to something that Henry Cejudo had said after the fight. Again, I don't think that Aljamima was being racist there either. It was just more so like them trolling, like, look, if we're gonna pretend everything's racist here, then if we're gonna play pretend, then let's play pretend, I guess. But that was pretty much the entirety of that whole situation there with Henry Cejudo and Karen Bryant. So I guess if you vaguely saw that, that's what it was in reference to. It was just Henry Cejudo using the name Aljamima. Another one is Israel Adesanya, who was talking about Yoel Romero and saying that he was going to hit him so many times that eventually he would collapse like the Twin Towers, and that seemed to piss some people off, albeit less people than what the Aljamima thing was. I didn't hear the actual statement from Israel Adesanya, but knowing what I know about Israel Adesanya, my assumption on this is that the 9/11 thing, or the Twin Towers collapsing, to him it wasn't a reference of like the people dying. It was more so a reference of a conspiracy theory with 9/11. So I think most people know what happened at 9/11, or at least they like know what the story is there, where you had a bunch of hijackers take some planes in America and fly into different spots. So there were a couple that landed in the Twin Towers, one that landed in the Pentagon, and then one that the passengers on the plane were able to stop the hijacker from hitting a major monument, and they eventually landed in a big open field in Pennsylvania. But that's sort of the official story on it. But there was also a really big contingency of people who were believing a conspiracy theory on it. And when I say conspiracy theory, that's not to say that they're wrong so much as it is like that is considered the conspiracy story for 9/11. But that's the one where they were saying that the government was behind this, and that the reason why Tower 7 went down, and the reason why the Twin Towers went down the way that they did, is because there was also a plane demolition aspect to it as well, and that the planes were sort of like a cover for it. So when you hear the meme, jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams, that's sort of like this idea there where the steel beams that were supporting the Twin Towers went down, and the official argument was that it was from all the burning jet fuel. And then the argument there was like, well, actually, no, that doesn't make any sense. The reason why it went down is because it was a plane demolition. And so that's sort of like become a meme. So to me, my comprehension of what Israel Adesanya was saying is that when he was saying, when he was making the comparison to the Twin Towers going down, it wasn't as though he was like scoffing at the 3,000 people who died. Even the people who like think that this was like a planned demolition and that the government's behind it, like even those people aren't like, oh, the people who supposedly are dead are faking it. Like no one's taking anything away from the people who died or the people whose lives were changed for the worse or changed forever on 9/11. It was more just an argument in terms of like what actually happened and what actually caused the damage, not whether or not the damage actually happened and whether or not the damage was awful and horrendous. So to me, my understanding of what Israel Adesanya was saying here is that he was just making a comparison to the way that they went down. I think he's sort of implicitly saying like the way that those towers went down was like a planned demolition, and it just went straight down, and Yoel Romero is going to fall down like it was a planned demolition with him, where he's going to collapse straight down to like at free fall speed. So I think it was more of just like a reference to kind of like the jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams, and 9/11 was an inside job. I think it's more of like a reference to like that conspiracy than it was like him trying to take a dig at the people in New York who died. So the people who were like, how can you make a joke about 9/11? There were 3,000 people that died there. This is terrible. That's not the context I'm getting from what Israel Adesanya said. From what I understand, what Israel Adesanya's point is that he tends to believe more in the demolition story in terms of the Twin Towers coming down, and he was just saying that the towers pretty much fell at free fall speed, and it's going to look like Yoel Romero's falling down at free fall speed after I hit him enough times. Like that was my understanding of it. So trying to read into what he was saying and saying that he was like diminishing the pain and suffering of the 3,000 people and their families from 19 years ago, I really didn't read into it that way. So I don't hold that much of a grudge against Israel Adesanya for making that reference. Was it a weird reference to make? Sure, I guess, but to me, it's not that big of a deal that he said it, and it seems like most of the people who got upset with it was just kind of like some random people on Twitter, and then it was a couple of his opponents, like Paulo Costa, really got after him after that. But to me, from the context from what he said, I don't think he was trying to dig at the people who actually suffered from 9/11. It was just a reference to a very well-known conspiracy theory. A couple more things to talk about. We got Dana White speaking at a Trump rally. On his face, this really isn't all that important. He just kind of spoke for like a minute and a half at a Trump rally. It's not clear that he like did any business work with Donald Trump there. I know some people were talking about how maybe he could like talk to Donald Trump there and try to get Darren Till a visa so he can be prepared for the March 7th card. Don't know whether or not that's actually something that happened. I don't think it was though. But there were a lot of people who were upset about Dana White doing that. Like, well, Dana White says he's not political, but here he is speaking at another Trump rally. If you listen to what Dana White says at these rallies, like his content is not political at all. It's pretty much just like, yeah, Donald Trump's a guy I've known for a while. He's a great friend. I'm the president of the UFC. I know fighters, and he's a fighter. Like that's the same speech he gave at the RNC. It's pretty much the same speech he just gave. So it's not as though it's not as though Dana White's like talking about immigration policy or talking about like minimum wage or talking about healthcare policy. Like he's just saying, this is a good guy. He's a good friend, and he's a fighter. Like if he's supporting a friend like that and he's not really making overly political statements, like I don't see the reason why people need to be getting upset about it. No, one of the funniest things about this is that some of the people who are getting upset about it, a lot of the big name journalists obviously were among them, is that they're like, well, imagine had a fighter done this at a burning rally. And it's like, we just had Kevin Lee speaking at a burning rally, and it's not as though the more right-wing MMA fans are like, oh my god, I can't believe Kevin Lee did that. It's just like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's fine. Like, there were some people who maybe disagree with Kevin Lee, like, oh, you don't know who you're supporting, or you don't know, like, what the positions are for these guys, but it's not as though there was a big outrage there, so I don't know why there would be any expectation for an outrage when Dana White's speaking at a Trump rally. Last thing to talk about, just a couple of fights that were announced. We have a really big fight at middleweight, so Chris Weidman's moving back down to middleweight after that really bad performance against Dominic Reyes. He's going to be fighting Jack Hermanson. As far as how this fight's going to go, I mean, if he fights Hermanson like he fought against Reyes, this isn't going to go well for him at all. Hermanson's a tough guy to ground and pound. He's got a really good guillotine choke as well, so if you shoot in kind of lazily on him, he can definitely put you out. And Hermanson's definitely hits pretty hard as well, too, so it's not going to be an easy fight for Chris Weidman. The problem with Weidman versus Reyes is that it was pretty clear he just didn't want to strike with Reyes at all. And when you make it obvious that your entire goal is to wrestle, it definitely makes it a lot easier to land shots on you. You got to make people concerned that they're going to get punched in the face before you shoot on them. Otherwise, they're going to be ready for your shots. So if he comes out here and he actually is like trying to strike with Jack Hermanson for a little bit before he starts to set up his shots, he can definitely be successful. But if he's going out there and just trying to wrestle him from the get-go, it's just probably not going to go very well for him. So to me, I think Weidman has what it takes to beat Hermanson. It's just going to be a matter of how does he fight him from a tactical standpoint. So we'll have to see how it goes from there. Another interesting fight to look at is at the heavyweight division. We have Andrei Arlovski versus a former PFL champion who I believe is making his UFC debut in Felipe Lins. I think both of these guys are actually out of ATT too, which is going to be pretty interesting. But it'll be interesting to see a guy who got that $1 million tournament win with the PFL coming over to the UFC. It'll be interesting to see how he does and see if he feels like he's making the right decision to leave the PFL and come over to the UFC. If he thinks that in the long term he's going to be able to make up that money and then some. If he's able to get into like the top 10, top 5, he can definitely make a lot more than he made in the PFL. But especially with the PFL, where it's not guaranteed that you're going to win the tournament every time, and you don't know how long the PFL is going to stay in business, especially since it seems like most of the money that they're bringing in is coming from investors, not from actual people paying for the product. But it seems as though he's pretty confident in his abilities, and we'll see how far he's able to go. But if he gets the win over Arlovski, that's definitely going to springboard him in the division and give him a chance to really work his way up the top pretty quickly. So that covers it for this week. Obviously, next week I'll be recapping the flyweight title fight. We'll have a new flyweight champion, either Benavidez or Figueiredo. Then we'll be previewing UFC, I believe it's 248, but Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero, and then Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk. So that's going to be an excellent card as well. So look forward to seeing what happens next week, and I'm sure, as it always happens, there'll be plenty of stuff that happens over the course of the week that I'll be talking about, and look forward to speaking to you guys then. Obviously, if you follow the podcast, it makes the most sense to subscribe. That's how you're going to be able to get the podcast downloaded directly into your phone or directly into whatever else you use to download your podcast. But if you like using YouTube or BitChute or other video players, obviously subscribing on YouTube or subscribing on BitChute's the way to go for you there.